Okay, welcome everyone. We are now starting our webinar this morning on data privacy, and we're very glad to have you with us. This is a webinar with Trusted Network, Securys and Llewellyn Consulting on data privacy during and after the coronavirus pandemic. And to start us off, I'm going to hand over initially to Peter Jones from Trusted Network.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody to another one of our Trusted Network webinars. We're in unprecedented times with the coronavirus, in that it's very different to any economic crisis that we've experienced in the past. The virus has affected businesses in all sectors globally, and is creating a huge amount of uncertainty and little visibility for governments and businesses to plan effectively and deal with the situation. Interestingly, in an era where technology should be the driver in overcoming the pandemic and getting the world back on track, it's highlighted challenges where, namely, the lack of clear data on identifying the extent of people being affected through to how data is actually being collected and its impact now and in the future on the legality and compliance of the data being gathered and how it may be used in the future. So this webinar brings together Trusted Network member and data privacy expert Ben Rapp, who is co-founder of Securys, and global economist John Llewellyn, founder of Llewellyn Consulting, for a panel discussion and Q&A to explore data privacy and the economic impact during and after the pandemic. So I'd also like to introduce you to Terry Paddock, who's going to be moderating the panel and taking questions that you can ask during the webinar. So I'm looking forward to what I know is going to be a fascinating discussion, and I'll hand back to you, Terry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And just before I introduce myself and Ben and John in a little bit more detail, you'll see some biographies for the three of us on your screen, but a few housekeeping announcements just in terms of the GoToWebinar platform. If your audio isn't clear, do try closing down your other applications because that may help save bandwidth. We do, as Peter said, encourage all of you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and I'll initially read the questions during the bulk of the presentation just to make sure that we are staying to time, and I will put them to the panelists as relevant. Please type your questions into the questions pane on the dashboard on the right of your screen, and I will read them as we go along and may name you before I pass them on to the panel. So, yes, hello, hi, my name is Terry. I am, I love my biography, serial entrepreneur. I am a communications professional with over 25 years experience, specializing in online publishing, social media, and content marketing, and with a particular expertise in the theater sector. So I absolutely can attest to a sector that has been, well, fundamentally shut down in its entirety by the current crisis. I am joined by the two experts on our panel, Ben Rapp, who is the co-founder and principal at Securys. He is a privacy and security specialist with, as you can see, an awful lot of qualifications. And he has a great strapline, I think, for Securys, which is about making privacy practical for enterprise. So hello, Ben.
Hi, Terry.
Hi. And can I say, as an American, am I allowed to pronounce it privacy, or do I need to say privacy?
We'd prefer you to say privacy, but we'll make allowances.
Okay, I'll work on that. I kind of flip transatlantically between privacy and privacy. John Llewellyn is co-founder at Llewellyn Consulting. John was global chief economist and senior economic policy advisor at Lehman Brothers, and also for nearly 2 decades was at the OECD. John was also the first convener, let me have got my notes here. He conducted the first international post-mortem on forecasting accuracy. He tells me that forecasting is my life and I always have a view on economics in particular. John, what is the big conclusion about forecasting?
Oh, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Terry. The big conclusion is that forecasting errors, which are a reflection of how well you understand things, divide into two groups. There's a large number of small errors and a small number of large errors. And the large ones come when you get a shock which is large and which is novel, both conditions, which of course is exactly what we've got at the moment. So exactly. A lot of uncertainty.
Exactly. So do we have any precedent in your vast experience to what we're living through at the moment economically?
No, we don't, and not even outside my vast experience, because the 1920s recession, depression in the United States even was quite a bit different, because that was caused by a collapse in confidence on the part of expenditure, not by a lockdown. So this is completely without precedent.
Completely without precedent, but we're going to try to make sense of it here today, and specifically looking at privacy and how it is being affected in what we're living through and the aftermath to come. I will say also, in terms of my own specialism, I have moderated, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds, probably over thousands of panels, but this is one of my first online panels and on the GoToWebinar platform. So please do bear with me if my normal skills are not shining through as much as I would like them to. But now, so as we carry on, we are dividing this discussion into three key areas. So those are shorter term risks, medium term risks, and long term risks. And in each of those, we have two key topics. As I said, we are asking you, encouraging you to submit questions as we go along, and then we'll have a longer question and answer session at the end. You will receive all of the slides at the end, as well as links to resources. A lot of this discussion is based on a fantastic vlog and blog series that Securys has been running. I really encourage you to follow up with those links for a lot more detail, because we can only really scratch the surface in the time allowed this morning. Okay, so let's see. We are going to start then, as you might imagine, by looking at the short-term risks for what we're going to. Oops, sorry, and there's my first technical thing. I am pressing too zealously. Let's see if we can get back to short-term risks. So short-term risk we've divided into two topics: the short-term risks relating to home working, and secondly, the over-collection and misprocessing of data. So Ben, could you talk us through home working in terms of breach and compromise of corporate and personal data?
Sure. I think the summary here is that we've had a very rapid, radical change in the way that people are collaborating. So, I mean, Microsoft yesterday described it as 2 years of digital transformation in 2 weeks. And the consequence is that it wasn't planned. And the consequence of it not being planned is that people are working on their own kit in their own homes with their own bandwidth outside the normal purview of corporate security and without having had lots of training in advance to understand what the risks might be. So we see both concerns around a variety of ways in which corporate data might be breached and also some concerns around how that interface between the corporate and the personal world is working. And then there are enhanced risks to people's personal digital environment from both criminals who are exploiting the pandemic and also the fact that they're much more dependent on their home infrastructure than they previously were.
Okay. That I did not go through that slide, I swear, it wasn't me. So going back to short-term risks. Okay, wonderful. So Ben, with these short-term risks and particularly in terms of cybercrime, we are all now pretty much working from home. Some of us aren't terribly used to that. Have you got any feel for how much cybercrime may be increasing in this period?
Oh, substantially. I mean, we know that there have been, it's very hard to put numbers on this. We've talked about doublings. We've seen people talking about 60, 70% increases, particularly in different kinds of what we call phishing attacks. So we're seeing a lot of people leveraging the pandemic, and effectively that's going to come in one of two flavors. It's either a personal attack, so this is an attack on you as an individual, and this will be somebody emailing you or potentially phoning you and using a pandemic-related excuse to panic you into disclosing information you otherwise wouldn't have done. So you might have somebody tell you that there's a run on your bank, or there's some other pandemic-related threat to your money, and they need to move your money into another account, or you're going to get a grant from the government, but they need your bank details in order to pay it. All that kind of obvious exploitation of people's current level of fear. From a corporate perspective, the risk is applying the same logic to corporate data. So instead of it being transferring money to your personal account, it might be to do with your business or with your employer, or they might be asking for health or contact information for other people in your organization. And the danger is that because people are currently slightly in a mode of compliance, they're in a mode of doing what they're told by authority, that's unusual, and we're being unusually obedient as a society. Anybody who presents themselves in an authoritarian way is more likely to get unquestioning compliance than they might have been 3 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I was talking to my brother, who runs a medium-sized enterprise in California, and he had never been a fan of home working before this started, and he has been really surprised by how quickly and well his company has adjusted. He's saying now that even once this ends, he is going to continue to use home working as a key part of how his business runs. John, what does that mean? Do you think that that is a common response that we're going to be seeing amongst businesses that will want to continue to use home working? And what might the economic implications be for that on business overall, and I guess on particular sectors like the commercial property sector?
It's certainly the case from every person that we've talked to as a company that they've been pleasantly surprised by what's possible with home working. I think that the typical pattern was, in the very first week or two, efficiency dropped a lot as people were learning, but that efficiency came back quite quickly. And now the view is, yes, it's more feasible than I'd thought. It's the Microsoft point that Ben Rapp was making, that a lot of has been crammed into a short period. That being said, people definitely miss the social contact. There's no doubt about that. Now, maybe they'll get that entirely through their private lives and not through meeting, but it's hard to believe that this is going to replace it totally. That being said, in many firms, it's going to be used a lot more, I think, for people with home responsibilities, people with whether they're men or women responsible for a family or for looking after a home. So there is going to be a permanent change, but I would suggest not total based on what we get told by our clients.
Okay, but and so if that is the case, there must be knock-on effects. So with commercial property, are we going to see office costs drastically reduced? Are we going to see property chains kind of going out of business? Have we seen the end of places like WeWork and their rivals?
Well, there are two things going on at the same time, of course. There's first of all, there's a recession, which is going to be quite deep. And we can talk about how deep that will be later. That will knock straight on to property prices. Then underlying that, there'll be the structural change, which you're talking about. It'll undoubtedly, I think, result in a big fall in property prices for several years relative to what they would have been otherwise. And then when they come back, there'll be change for different sorts of property, probably with better properties being much less hit than less good properties. It'll widen the differentiation between the good properties and the poorer commercial properties.
And then I guess, of course, Ben has mentioned to me before that this is probably the end of the one meeting flight. So that obviously the airlines are being hugely affected anyway, but in terms of the really their reliance on business travel, the longer term effects might be permanent in terms of how it affects them in that way.
The airlines are in for a doubly tough time. I mean, the first actually relates to climate change. As they start to get charged an economic price for the fuel that they use, that'll push them back to a cost structure that they had 10 or 15 years ago. And that cost structure was one in which there were very few holiday brigade, low cut cost airline travel. And then the business travel is going to be hit by this modern trend towards working from remotely. So I think that airlines are going to be doubly hit. It's going to be a very tough 10 years ahead for them.
Okay. Ben, the upside for individual businesses might be, however, that their office costs will go down, but at the same time, we must expect that their IT security costs will go up. Is that a fair assumption? And proportionally, what kind of increase are you talking about based on business sector and size?
I think it'll vary, and the larger the enterprise is, the better they'll absorb this change. And that's the funny thing, that for very large enterprises, this might offer an opportunity significantly to downscale their commercial property estate, but they already have scale IT security functions. Because really what you need here is more support. There's a technology spend, and one of the things that we need to see people doing if this is going to become the new normal is investing in a better distributed security environment, so that they have better insight into what machines are being used by whom, where, to do what with their data. But a lot of this is about making sure that there's somebody that the home worker can call, from whom they can get a response quickly if something happens about which they're not certain. And I don't mean a technology problem, my mouse isn't working. I mean, I've had this email, it's asking me to do something. Should I? Is it real? How do I know whether this conference call is a conference call I should be joining, whether I should be filling in this form, logging into this platform? And that outreach, education and support program is the catch up that we'll have to do as we move to home working. For small enterprises, the cost of that might, at least to begin with, be comparable to the cost of continuing to run an office and being able to keep an eye on it, because they're also going to have to invest clearly in remote working platforms and all that kind of stuff. For large enterprises who already have that, I think there's more of a threat to the commercial property sector, because they can clearly move to remote working a lot of the time and then use a smaller space to convene team meetings from time to time to keep that face-to-face contact going.
Okay. Another thing that a lot of people are experiencing during this time of home working is Zoom. Now, we are obviously not using Zoom for the webinar here today, but Zoom's stock price has gone up enormously. I don't know what the figures are in its uptake, but we know that even the House of Commons, even Parliament, is using Zoom. Why, Ben, do you suggest that people just reconsider how they're using Zoom, and why that platform in particular is of concern to you?
So, I mean, the thing with Zoom is it wasn't really built for the use cases to which it's being put now. And there's this thing called security and privacy by design, which is actually a legal obligation now for anybody inside the GDPR area, which requires you to think at the time you're building a product about baking security and privacy into it. And it's reasonably clear that Zoom didn't do that. And that's what gave them their technology advantage. You know, the less security you put into something, the faster it works, because inevitably security is kind of wasted processor cycles trying to protect you against threat. And if you choose to disregard the threat, you can run quicker. The problem is that if you don't bake it in at the beginning, then putting it in retrospectively is hard. And that's what Zoom are finding now, that trying to suddenly putting passwords on meeting rooms and thinking about how they might do actual encryption between endpoints and this kind of thing is slowing down the development process. It's going to slow their product down and make it more like Teams and GoToMeeting and so on in usability terms. Right now, they are in that awful middle ground where they still have the fundamentally insecure product, but they've started to layer very afterthoughty security elements on top of it that are going to affect its ease of use without necessarily securing it. And there's a number of ways in which these kind of video platforms can cause breaches. There is obviously Zoom bombing, this thing of people being able to join meetings, which is largely, I think, mitigated by having this password. But there's also things like having notifications pop up on your desktop while you're sharing a screen, or having other windows on your desktop appear, something we've just recently did a blog about. And better platforms automatically turn off notifications when you're in the platform, and they allow you to select what you're sharing so that you only share the document you meant to share, not your whole desktop. And again, Zoom doesn't yet have that kind of functionality. So I think if you're talking about anything that is either confidential commercially or confidential from a personal data point of view, you'd be better to use a platform that has inherent security, certainly at this time, and wait for Zoom to catch up if that's what they're going to do.
Okay. Before we move on then to topic 2 in short-term risks, what can we summarize as the key takeaway from the home working topic, Ben?
From my point of view, companies need to not just see this as a sort of sudden rent-free bonus. They have to think about putting investment into supporting their staff over the long term. And if they're going to adopt home working strategically, they have to actually have a strategy and have a support function for it. Because
really, even more so than usual, security is about the human risk, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Privacy and security are both fundamentally about people, and there isn't really a substitute for teaching people how to do it safely. You can't just throw tech at it.
Okay. John, any key takeaway from you for home working?
Well, speaking as an economist, I'd say it's accelerated developments which would have happened more slowly. In the process, it's increased productivity for some groups. Whether that gets reflected in the national statistics is another question, because they have huge problems measuring these things, but it's undoubtedly increased productivity in some respects, but it's not going to totally change the way people work. There'll still be offices.
Okay. Good to know. All right, so over collection and misprocessing of data, and particularly now we are being asked so much about health data. Ben, what implications does that have for employers, customer surveys, community groups, and the like?
So I think you can probably think about this in 2 boxes, really. One is, any number of people have felt that they need to get involved and help and do something, at this time of crisis, in these difficult times. And a lot of that has meant collecting health information about whatever they see as their stakeholder audience. And box 1 is employers who are quite rightly trying both to support the well-being of their staff and manage risk to their staff. So they're trying to get a handle on, who has COVID symptoms, who may be suffering as a consequence, who might be infectious and therefore shouldn't be allowed to come to work if they're still open, or, as we move towards perhaps a relaxation of lockdown, who might be allowed to come back. And the problem is that the people doing this collection have not previously been geared up to do health data properly, and there are some very strict rules around how you're supposed to collect and manage health data, and most of those seem to be being ignored. And then the other box, which I think is less forgivable, is organizations doing COVID outreach to customers, so to consumers, and including questions about your health and well-being in customer surveys. And it's not entirely clear why they're doing that. It's pretty clear that doing it is unlawful, and it's certainly going to end up with them breaching health information and presumably being fined as and when the regulator starts enforcing again. I think it also risks consumer trust, because people aren't stupid and they will figure out that their bank doesn't really care about their health. It's just trying to update its risk profile, or it's trying to look caring. And they will start to ask themselves, why does my bank want to know whether I've got COVID or not?
Yeah. And you've noted, Ben, that Matt Hancock, the health secretary, and the ICO, and just remind us, ICO stands for?
Information Commissioner's Office.
Thank you. I have to do my acronym alert. You said that they've issued some misleading information regarding this. What misleading information is that?
Well, I mean, it's specifically Hancock was misleading because he invented some kind of magic public interest excuse for processing health data, whoever you are in whatever circumstances, that just doesn't exist. The processing of health data in the public interest is the function of the public sector, and if you're not in the public sector, you don't get to do that unless you are specifically instructed to do so in law, not just because a minister feels it might be fun. So you have to be very careful about kind of throwaway comments on Twitter. We're seeing this a lot, that ministerial guidance is being interpreted as law, and it's not. The ICO has taken a very relaxed view around enforcement, because I think it wants to be seen not to be getting in the way of particularly community response, but also generally people trying to do something to help. My personal view is that that's mistaken. The job of the ICO is to protect us from threats to our privacy and to our personal data, and it is other people's jobs to respond to the pandemic, and the ICO should be carrying on doing its actual job. But what that's led to is people feeling that there's a free-for-all, and I think there are some very nasty long-tail risks in that, because the trouble with health data is that once you've given it, you can't take it back. It's out there. And it may not just be your COVID status, there could be other pieces of health information. There will be other pieces of health information in that database.
Great. Well, I'm sure we're going to be returning to the long tail. But in the meantime, we have a great question from Ian Dillamar. And apologies, Ian, if I've mispronounced your name. But Ian says, I've worked for years with health data projects. Do you think we can expect a raft of GDPR compliance issues following this? Ben?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that right now, people quite rightly are focused on their own survival. They're focused on their economic prospects. They are, clapping for carers and wanting to see something being done. We're going to see that still probably for some weeks, but as things return to normal, or we have a new normal in which, the kind of level of panic has subsided and we simply accept that there are restrictions on our movement and our other behavior, people are going to be seeing their health data misused. There are going to be breaches inevitably, and people are going to start asking questions about why so much collection was permitted, why there was no enforcement, and they will be seeking retrospective enforcement either through the ICO or directly through the courts.
Okay, and so John, this leads to your area of expertise on this topic, which suggests that if these infractions are being called out, that there could be fines that result from them. What do you expect from that? And might this be a good way for the government to earn some money? They're shelling out a lot of money trying to keep the economy going at the moment. Is this going to be the payback?
No, I don't think they're going to. They're going to solve the problem of the federal or national budget deficit and the national debt with these fines. Unfortunately, not even the ones which are levied on the very biggest companies can come up to 4% of revenue. No, the purpose of these fines is to dissuade, preferably, of course, in advance. Ideally, you want a company to modify its behavior before it has to be fined, and then you fine a few, as the French would say, pour encourager les autres, to demonstrate, to discourage them from doing what they shouldn't be doing. Not of macroeconomic significance, but of potentially very large behavioral significance, I would suggest.
Okay. Can you just expand on that a little bit? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, your question was, would this be able to make a dent in the level of borrowing and the level of national debt? No, not a chance. This is a huge number. I mean, remember what this pandemic is doing. It's leading government to expand their public sector borrowing in percentage points of GDP. We're likely to come out in this country with national debt, which was running at 80-something% of GDP, to being 140% of GDP. These are massive numbers.
Right.
The fines are not on that scale, but that doesn't mean they're not important. They're extremely important in what they'll do to other people.
And they are, they can be quite substantial from the perspective of the companies affected. Now, another aspect in terms of overcollection and misprocessing and a potential knock-on to economics is, what do you think this will do to health sector economics, John? Is it, I mean, if so many other private organizations, health-related organizations are collecting this kind of data, can they use it in ways for perhaps more video consultation? And does that in some way affect how the NHS might run? Is it kind of a way of privatizing some functions of the NHS?
I think there are a lot of issues in here. I mean, one issue, and I think we'll come to it more, is the big data issue. And there's no doubt that if you can get really good quality, clean, big data, anonymized, there's absolutely no need to attach it to people's names at all. If you can get access to big databases like that, you can sometimes do wonderful things in terms of finding out leads and lags and correlations and what causes what in a way that you can't. Alternatively, you can test theories which you've already got. That's very powerful. That's quite a different question, of course, from what Ben's been talking about, which is what happens when small amounts of data get collected in all sorts of places by different people and aren't very secure and get misinterpreted and misused. That's really going to be a dog's breakfast, and for many people also a personal, intrusive and dangerous dog's breakfast. So there are two very big issues here. A third issue in here, of course, is the use of the technology for diagnosis, and that's undoubtedly going to change. I've always watched with great interest the Australian Flying Doctor Service, where they use technology amazingly well to have an interchange between the person who's injured or got a disease and the doctor in headquarters. And they've developed that extremely highly, and there'll be some of that here too. That's a third strand. But there again, you'll want to address Ben's point of making sure that such data as the person gives are kept properly secure.
Okay. Okay, great. So then let's just summarize, if we can, here in terms of overcollection and misprocessing. And again, as John has suggested, we're really just scratching the surface of everything that can be covered in this area. But Ben, what can we do? What can companies do about not over collecting and misprocessing? I guess the answer is in the question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about remembering that privacy is still a thing, and our message here is always remember that behind the data there's a real live human being, and you have an opportunity to harm or help. And if you do the wrong thing, you can cause real harm to a real person, and they really matter, which is something that I think it's easy to lose track of when what you're doing is wrangling large piles of data. So what they need to do is involve privacy people, involve their privacy office in everything that they're thinking about doing, and be prepared to do less. Try to think always about what's the minimum we can do, what's the minimum we can collect, what's the minimum period we can keep data for in order to achieve our objective. And is there some way of achieving our objective that doesn't involve collecting identifiable health information about individuals? I think that's the critical point. And just to John's point earlier about anonymized data, you have to be very careful with the claim that you can anonymize data, because both health and location information are very hard to anonymize because of the level of detail that you're collecting and the degree of uniqueness in the kind of fingerprint of somebody's health records. Just taking their name off it doesn't really make it anonymous, particularly when there are all these other reservoirs of identifiable data around. So there are lots of studies that show that with between 5 and 15 data points, you can de-anonymize anonymized data sets. So anonymity isn't a panacea. It doesn't fix everything. A lot of this is about either not doing things or putting much better security around the things that you are doing.
Okay, thank you. And John, any key takeaway from you for overcollection and misprocessing?
No, except that I just want to emphasize what Ben has just said. I learned this from Ben in the first instance, and he directed me to the literature. And it is quite horrifying how easy it is to de-anonymize data. We should all, as individuals in this, be very, very stringent and require really thorough guarantees, which are checked not by politicians, but by technicians, by mathematicians, that this process is safe.
Okay, great. Well, let's now move on to medium-term risks, because the first topic here will relate quite a bit to this. And I am seeing if I can get those arrows coming up. Cindy, I'm having trouble driving. If you can take us to the next slide, you might be doing it more quickly than, oh, no, there we go. Thank you very much. Medium-term risk. So the topics in this section relate specifically to marketing first and to track and trace second. But marketing, of course, the data issues are really coming to the fore here, and how companies are using the data that they have access to. So Ben, talk us through misuse, pecker breaches, and customer trust. And first of all, remind us what PECR is.
So PECR is the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation, otherwise known as the e-Privacy Directive. And this is the European version of the American CAN-SPAM Act. It's the law, the rules about sending out electronic marketing communication by email, by text, and also, in fact, about automatically dialing phones. But never mind that. And the reason I'm calling this a medium-term risk is because this is about anticipating the return to the new normal. So this is about lockdown being relaxed and businesses that have been closed reopening, and clearly having a kind of pent-up demand for marketing. There's going to be a ferocious amount of marketing and advertising over the next 3 to 6 months as everybody tries to restart their market. And clearly, this is one of those moments where there's an opportunity for changes in the established order, for people who get this right to leapfrog previously successful competitors who don't get it right. And so the pressure on marketing departments is going to be substantial, and there is an enormous temptation to misuse data that you already have, or this data that you've collected during the kind of over collection period. So it's a follow-on from the previous topic. And we're already seeing some of this now, which is why it worries me so much. Because if people are misusing data now, imagine what they're going to do when they actually have something to sell.
Can you give us an example? What's an egregious email that you've received so far?
Oh, I get about 6 a day. It's somebody sending me something called a COVID-19 service update. So they send you an email that is a message from their CEO, and it's lots of, high-minded stuff about what they're doing to deal with COVID, and what the impact on the service that their organization provides to you might be, all of which is nominally kind of okay, if slightly wearing. And then you get to the bottom third of the email, and it's a marketing message saying, look out for our new product launch, or we're still doing this, or you can still buy that, or whatever it is. And the point about that is really twofold. Legally speaking, if I haven't consented to receive marketing communication from them by email, they're breaking the law by sending me an email that has any marketing content in it at all. And this has been a law that the ICO has previously enforced quite aggressively. In fact, that's true for all the European regulators. Lots and lots and lots of individually relatively small, but they add up, fines for misusing email in this way. But the other point is about customer trust. I might be inclined to be sympathetic towards, an airline or, a bank or a stock trading platform or something like that. If all they want to do is tell me how hard they're finding it, you kind of ask yourself why, but that's fine. But when it turns out that they're trying to elicit my sympathy so that they can subsequently sell me something, and I know that I've not signed up to be sold to by them, what they end up doing is annoying me, and then I'm less likely to buy from them, and I'm more likely to complain about it, and they subsequently get fined.
Okay. John, what are the economic implications to the return to some form of new normal marketing? What can we anticipate in the online and offline ad market in particular?
I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question, but I think Ben is making an extremely important point here, which is the degree to which some of this stuff can be counterproductive. You do sometimes wonder when you read this stuff which comes in from companies and CEOs, where they realize that everybody else is doing the same thing, and that you're just getting more and more irritated at being told at the top of the email, the security of our staff is paramount. Then you're told we want to do as much as we can for you, and then comes the advertising pitch. It's pretty unsubtle. They probably each think it through for their own purposes. They each reach the same conclusion and don't add up to what it looks like for the person whose screen is being flooded by this rubbish. So I think the whole advertising industry is going to have to take a careful look at itself, and will do so. And at the same time, a crucial question here will be just how much we enforce these rules, because they're there, but they're not really enforced, as Ben says. So it's going to transform, it has to transform the advertising industry. And I think some of the most egregious sinners in this will hopefully go to the wall.
I mean, it seems kind of odd to be thinking of about being advertised in the current circumstances. Should companies just not be advertising at the moment?
I think if they've got something to say, by all means. And if I've said, yes, I'd like to receive your stuff, but I don't like seeing it disguised in a not very clear, plain wrapper.
Okay. Okay, fine. So what can companies do when they're thinking now about their marketing? Ben, what's the key takeaway from your perspective?
Well, I think there are two. I mean, I think one is you do have some sensitivity to your audience and understand how what you're doing comes across, and do go and read the rules, and stick to the rule. The rules are not, as with all of privacy regulation, they're not just pettifogging, box ticking. They were written to protect real people from real harms, and so they have real value. And if you stick to the rules, you can produce a marketing campaign that is more likely to elicit support from its audience. But I think the other thing to do is resist temptation. And I think the one that really worries me, because of all this overcollection, and because everybody's moved online, right? So everyone's doing all their shopping online now. So the information that's available to very large online retailers, but also through data enrichment services like Experian and the other market research agencies, is obviously considerably expanded. And so there's a significant risk that you're going to see, slightly, tone deaf retargeting or targeted marketing, because it's not very difficult to work out, for example, who hasn't had some kind of significant COVID impact if you've got enough social media and over collected data to play with. And I think people have to resist being too clever. It's this is where I use this Jeff Goldblum quote from Jurassic Park, which is, just because you can, are you sure that you should?
Mm-hmm. Right, indeed. And John, any key takeaways from you for marketing?
Purely that this is just one more thing which is going to be transformative. And the companies and the individuals who find a way of giving me what I want and not giving me what I don't want will flourish, and the others won't.
Yeah. I mean, and businesses are going to be desperate to get back to some sort of normal revenue stream, if not normality itself. So the pressure is going to be enormous, isn't it?
The pressure is going to be enormous, because if you look at how long it takes economies to get back to the level of GDP that they were at before the thing started, it's quite depressingly long. Often it's 4 to 5 years. So this has set us back a lot, and the pressures, as you rightly say, are going to be immense.
Immense. Okay, let's move on to the second topic in medium term, and it's a term that we've all become familiar with in the past few weeks, and that is track and trace. Ben, what are the issues around consent, again, breach risks of a centralization of data in this case, and the stigma risk? What do you mean by that? Tell us about track and trace.
Okay, so this is potentially a very long topic. I did write a long and slightly technical paper on this that is available and will be linked to later in the presentation. I mean, essentially what we're trying to do is find a way to release people from lockdown, but at scale keep track of outbreaks of infection and the kind of circles of infection around the initially detected person. And we want to do that with technology, and we're doing it broadly, globally. The current plan is to do it with smartphone apps, and for those apps to use some combination of location data and something called Bluetooth beaconing, which is basically where your phone picks up all the phones around it, and each of those phones has a unique identifier, and so it knows which phones it's been near. And then at some point, if somebody is reported as having coronavirus and they upload their phone's identifier, I'm very much simplifying here, your phone can work out that it's seen that identifier and therefore you must have been near them, and so you're at infection risk. And there are a whole bunch of issues here. The first is that this kind of thing only works if you have mass adoption. You need about 60% of the population to have the app and use it for it to work. But everyone is suggesting that we're going to do this on the basis of consent. And this is both a technical point about GDPR in terms of what's the justification for using health data in this way or location data in this way, but it's also a question of approach. If we're saying to people, please download this app because you're helping us, there comes a point where the strength of the plea makes it unlikely that people are really consenting. They're doing it because they're being told to. It's just not necessarily legally mandated. And I'm very uncomfortable about that because it goes against the principle of how consent is supposed to work. And I think we should be honest and say, look, if everybody has to download this thing, then everybody has to download this thing, and we should mandate it. That, whether it's done by consent or it's done by legal obligation, we then have this issue about all the data that we're collecting. We know where everybody is all the time. We know who they're meeting, and you can see how tempting that data will be to people other than epidemiologists. So, you know, this is something that the security services has wanted forever. If you could track an extremist and everybody they've met forever, you know, you can see why you wouldn't really want to give that up. And it's useful for traffic planning, and it's useful for identifying immigrants. And there's endless, horrible, increasingly dystopian use cases for that kind of data. And one of the things that's disturbing, and we'll come back to exactly why it's so disturbing in the long-term risks, is that the UK particularly has chosen to centralize the database of people's contacts, where everybody in Europe is trying to keep it local on the phone, so that ultimately the individual rather than government has control of that matching process. The stigma risk goes a bit beyond that. So if you think about how these apps work, you get an alert that says you have been in contact with somebody who has been identified as having coronavirus. You're then expected both to report this so that your contacts can be traced, and also to isolate yourself. As a consequence, for a start, the person at the center of that little ripple is in danger of having fingers pointed at them, because the consequence for everybody they've been in contact with is that they have to stop working for 2 weeks and may not get paid, particularly if they're self-employed. And the more that ripples out, the more you can see that there's a potential stigmatization of somebody who did anything you can identify as risky behavior that led to them becoming the source of a localized lockdown. The other thing is the danger that people start asking to see your phone so that you can prove that you haven't had a match. So that you can say, look, I haven't been near anybody who, I should have a prop here where it is, you know, look, I haven't had any contact with infected people, so I'm clean. And that's, you know, both from a privacy perspective horrific, but also from a civil liberties perspective, you know, how many people are ultimately going to decide that they have the right to demand to see your, you know, COVID-free status, or your implied COVID-free status. So I'm very cautious about this move to using track and trace. I'm also not convinced epidemiologically that it's going to work in large countries and dense cities like London without significant other impact on our civil liberties.
Okay. And John, what Ben has just described seems like it would have lots of kind of stop and go and increased uncertainty in terms of the economic impact. What do you think? How will this process, this approach, affect the shape of our economic recovery?
I don't know if it affects the shape of the recovery, but it does take us into a very, very important point. Ben said that these data are being collected centrally, and that's the British way. Organize it from the center. And where track and trace is concerned, in fact, where this whole COVID-19 exercise is concerned, the British centralization has worked against it enormously compared with the decentralized countries. Decentralized countries, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, for example, Vietnam, would you believe, have had testers out spread all over the country and have been able to track and trace without having to resort to technological tricks of this sort at all. The UK has a highly centralized system in which everything gets run from here in London, and we've seen how disastrous that's been because they can't even run a logistics system to give people gowns, and then come up with a suggestion that, well, in the way to do this is technology, and guess what? We're going to centralize that into a database. I think standing behind all of these issues is that this country should be a lot more careful about this notion of automatically moving to centralization. And if they were to look at others ranging from Germany to Estonia, a whole range of countries, we could be a safer place if we didn't centralize as much and didn't use something like COVID-19 as an excuse for centralizing yet further.
Okay. Gosh, it's very interesting, because you would think centralizing and would offer economies of scale and consistency, but there are real risks associated with it.
That's exactly what the government will always say. It's exactly what the Treasury will always say. And the evidence so frequently runs in the opposite direction. It's the we know best syndrome. When you ally it, of course, with German experience, which is what happens when you centralize record keeping, that scares them rigid. We're quite careless in this country, partly because we've not had a truly malevolent experience with the government in the way that so many other countries have. Sleepwalking to a disaster is the phrase that's so commonly used. I think we're doing exactly that.
Oh my goodness. Okay, Ben, I do also just want to pick up, Google and Apple are obviously collaborating on creating a tool to enable track and trace, and I believe that it's this week that they are releasing the API to public health authorities that are using it. Do we know that the UK government is using that?
No, we don't, and that's one of the problems, that the UK is just generally ploughing its own furrow here in a kind of weird Brexit spirit way, and that suggests two things. One is that the privacy risks from the UK approach may be worse, because what Apple and Google are doing, if you accept the principle of using Bluetooth beacon track and trace as a thing, then what they've done is good and laudable. It's also actually necessary, because particularly on Apple phones, it's highly likely that the app that the NHS has currently developed won't work because of how the Apple Bluetooth stack functions. So this failure to collaborate, which we saw with PPE procurement, and which we've definitely seen with app development, there's a single European initiative to develop a privacy protecting track and trace app. And then there's the UK going off in its own direction over here for reasons that escape me. And as a consequence, it's likely that our app is going to be less private and less functional. And they certainly haven't waited for the Google-Apple joint initiative. There are some issues with that, in that the Apple initiative doesn't work on older phones. So anything earlier than an iPhone 6 Plus, I believe, won't be able to get the update in the first place. And for Apple, you have to download a new version of the operating system for the track and trace app to work if it's using the Apple stack. The Android system allows slightly more flexibility, but that's probably too boringly technical. I'd quite like to come back to John, because we were talking offline earlier on about this. And the concern for me with track and trace is this likelihood that we'll effectively be released and then locked back down again and then released, which was always the Ferguson model of, contraction and relaxation. And particularly in London, given how population dense we are and how our public transport systems work, it seems to me that if we do use track and trace, particularly with the app that the government's proposed, which is unlikely to be very accurate, we'll end up with a lot of quite extensive local lockdowns. And John, you were talking about an accordion-shaped recovery earlier.
Yes,
on.
we were, Ben.
That may be one consequence.
Yes, all of these past recessions, which we data mine to see what they'll tell us, tell you different things. There was a debate initially about whether the shape of the recovery would be V-shaped or U-shaped, with people saying, good heavens, I hope it's not L-shaped. The consensus, I think, already is that it'll be U-shaped and certainly not V-shaped. But as Ben and I were discussing, to the extent that you get people released from lockdown in tranches, and to the extent that you get mini lockdowns after that because it breaks away again, what we've just seen happen in Germany, then it's highly likely in our judgment that you'll see something we've never seen before, which is this accordion-shaped recovery, in which it takes, who knows, anything between 2 and 7 years to get back to the level of GDP that we started with, but the path has definitely got lots of little V's in it. I think that's highly likely in this case. The notion that will come steaming out fast, I think, is hoping for too much. And the notion that will come out slowly but smoothly is probably asking too much. Accordion shape, much more likely.
Accordion, goodness me. Okay, we are going to move on to the longer term risks, which we have started touching on already. But before we do, let's just again recap. What is the key takeaway in terms of track and trace? Ben, what can we do about track and trace?
I don't know as much I don't know, it depends who we is, right? I mean, I think we can keep shouting about the government's unwillingness to accept that tech is not some kind of magic bullet that will fix this, and then B, refusal to listen to experts around the world who are giving guidance on how to do this in a way that is, adequately cognizant of people's privacy. Ultimately, it's going to come down to our personal willingness to accept the compromise of our privacy in return for being allowed out of our houses. I mean, I'm quite worried that we will end up with a situation where if you haven't downloaded this app, you aren't going to be released from lockdown, because that's the only way I can see getting mass adoption.
Okay, sorry. And I have slightly gone a step ahead already and taken us through to the long-term risk, because I was worried that my clicker wasn't going to work, but here we are.
Oh, no, too far.
Now I didn't touch anything there. All right, oh, I don't know what's happening. Long-term risk. Okay, we're on long-term risks now. And again, we have two key topics. And this section of the webinar, we're looking at permanent loss of privacy. And yes, the Brexit risk. Remember Brexit? Remember we were all consumed by that. It seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. But let's look first at permanent loss of privacy. Ben, what are your concerns in terms of surveillance, immunity, passports, and rights? We already started talking about this with track and trace, but it has, as we have noted, much longer term implications.
Well, this is you know the next step on, right? So once we either get an effective antibody test and have demonstrated that you develop sufficient immunity for it to be relevant, or we get a vaccine that works, then the whole question is going to be, how do you tell who's immune? How do you tell who's been vaccinated? Because if we are in a situation where we're not able to eliminate the virus, which seems, I think, quite likely, and we've already seen that Germany relaxed and has now had to tighten up again, then immunity is really the only way back to proper normal. And proper normal means, you know, easy access to mass transit, easy international travel, mass participation events, you know, spectator sports, theatres, cinemas, your sector, you know, is kind of dependent on this. You can't really make a theatre work with social distancing, because you've got 33% occupancy if you space the auditorium out enough, and that doesn't make money. So we're going to have to either have a properly ubiquitous vaccination program like we've done historically, but at extraordinary speed. And I think there's, again, the UK is not in a good place to deliver that kind of thing, because we're bad at that kind of thing. Or we will end up with what Bill Gates and others have been proposing, which is an immunity passport. And you know, there are two consequences to that. One is for countries like Britain, where you haven't historically had to carry a form of ID, and no one has had the right to ask you who you are unless you're in, you know, reasonable suspicion of committing an offence. Suddenly, we will have an ID card by the back door. And then the question is, well, where will you be expected to produce this? How often? Every time you get on a tube train? Every time you go into a theatre? Every time you go into work? You know. Think about all the circumstances in which it would be attractive to know that everybody in your surroundings was immune. And I think that means losing all sorts of privacy. We're going to lose the fundamental privacy of our identity that is one of the things that historically distinguished Britain from the continent, that our police don't have the power to demand your identity. And we're also going to be surrendering some health data. And the question is, well, once you've said it's okay to ask people about COVID, what other infectious diseases is it okay to ask about, and where do you stop?
You
know?
Absolutely. And by the way, attendees, please do keep sending in your questions. I am looking out for them, and we are going to, after this section, open up to questions generally on any of the sections or anything related to these topics that you want to put to Ben and John. But John, let me return to you in terms of permanent loss of privacy. What our bullet point here says that there are chilling effects on the economic recovery in terms of impact on employment and mass gatherings. What's your take on that?
There's going to be a disconnect between the answer Ben gave, which I think was absolutely right, and the point I'm going to make, and I apologize for that, but I think the 2 points have to be made. Cast your mind back to the period post-2008 and the sort of recovery that we were seeing in the whole of the Western world and beyond. It was lackluster by previous standards. You could tell that in all sorts of ways. Output growth was slow, productivity growth was slow. There were no inflation pressures anywhere of any significance. And interest rates were very low, which tells you that the desire collectively to invest was low relative to the desire to save. So we entered this with a recovery which had lasted 12 years and was slow, lackluster by all historical standards. And there was already very serious talk about what do you do to restore confidence so that people see a future that they want to invest in. We've run out of monetary policy levers. The thought was we'll have to use government expenditure and taxation, fiscal policy levers. So that's the baseline we left. And then we hit this COVID exercise, which gives us a U-shaped or an accordion-shaped recovery. But when you're talking about long-run risks, the question becomes recover to what? And you ask yourself, has anything which we've seen give you more encouragement about the future rate of growth, if you're a firm, the desire to invest? When I listen to Ben talk, I think, no, that doesn't point to a confidence increasing step or set of steps. So it's very hard at the moment under present governance to see how we're going to get back to a long-term recovery that's encouraging. I think we're going to have an absolutely fundamental reassessment of a lot of our institutions and our policies and give people their confidence back. And giving them confidence back of their data is one element in that, because they're not going to be happy with the way it is at the moment.
Yeah, this actually relates to another great question that we've had from Ian de Lamar. And Ian says, we've been passive members largely in the information economy around our health data and consumerism. Are there opportunities here for individuals to become more in control of their data and participate in their own information economy? Ben, do you want to tackle that and perhaps also speak to the disconnect that John has noted?
Yeah, I mean, let's do Ian's question first. I mean, there have been some really interesting kind of edge case thoughts around how we might change the balance of control. You might know that Tim Berners-Lee, slightly under the radar, has been doing something around trying to turn the relationship between data controllers and data subjects around so that effectively you as the individual control a repository of your private data, and you can then choose what of it to give to whom in a very selective way. And you know, I could go on for ages about how Estonia does this, which is also quite interesting. But ultimately, there is a question about better transparency and better ownership, and reminding everybody that personal data belongs to the data subject. It doesn't belong to the data controller. So the data that Google has about you doesn't belong to Google, it belongs to you. And Google don't behave as if that's the case. And that's really, I mean, actually the American CCPA, their privacy law, is a commercial privacy law that's about the fact that it's your data, it belongs to you, and you should get paid for uses of it. And so that drives a potentially interesting conversation about if we're going to have to give out more of our health data in order for the economy to recover, and I think John's point's absolutely right about that, then perhaps we have to be put in control of it, not the government, and there has to be some turning around of that. And talking to John's disconnect, I mean, this is the whole challenge, right? From a privacy point of view, people like me are going to be saying, you know, immunity passports are scary, and health data sharing is scary, and there's a real question of genies getting out of bottles. But from an economic perspective, no one is going to go to a football match unless they have reasonable confidence they're not going to come away from it with coronavirus. So, you know, we do have to find some balance, because if people can't be given the confidence to go out, and this is exactly what happened in Germany also. So they had a double whammy. On the one hand, their relaxation appeared to lead to exactly the kind of resurgence in coronavirus cases that people were worried about. On the other hand, they opened their shops and no one turned up. You know, they had really low footfall because people were frightened. And so I think there are no really simple answers, but we've got to find some way of balancing this, and perhaps putting data subjects in greater control of their data and decentralizing, to John's point, is the way to do that, and saying you choose what you hand out and you choose when, and it can't be compelled. Yeah. But you know, I think we could go on about this for ages, and I'm conscious that we still have other topics to cover.
Okay, and but let's just have our little recap again. What is the key takeaway then in terms of permanent loss of privacy? What can we do, Ben?
I think we have to, above all, see our regulators step up. I mean, I've said this before about the ICO in a number of fora, but they have got to start agitating properly for appropriate respect for privacy, particularly in the private sector, where we've clearly lost control, but also in terms of government response. And I think for me, a lot of that is about minimization of access. If we accept that people are going to have to collect health data to protect us from the pandemic, that cannot be shared with other arms of government for other purposes.
Okay, and John, any key takeaway from you?
Yes, just building on Ben's point, you've got to give people confidence in the future in all its dimensions. All its dimensions include believing that growth is going to be faster, believing that investment is going to be stronger, believing that government is going to take good technocratic decisions, which this government, for example, in this country has simply not done by and large. We're not governed by people who've ever run anything. Until people have that degree of confidence, we're facing a lackluster future compared with our potential. And I look very interestedly, for example, at how some other countries like Germany have shared this. They've done a remarkably better job than this country has. It's probably why we're leaving the competition.
Ooh. Oh, that's a nice lead on to our next and final topic before we go freestyle. But just to put a marker for you, John, we've had a great question from Steve, which I'm going to ask you to return to after we cover off the Brexit risk. And Steve is asking, given all these risks that we've covered so far, why are stock markets holding up so well? Does Wall Street know something we don't? So John, put that in your thinking cap. I'm sure you will have plenty to say about that. But let's turn to Brexit finally in terms of our agenda. What is the Brexit risk where it relates to the aftermath of this pandemic? Ben, what is the adequacy agreement and why might we not get it?
So this is the hidden landmine, or hidden, I suppose, sea mine. As we cruise through the choppy waters towards Brexit, we've missed, I think, generally a risk in the conversation that we're having. At the moment, we are able to share data with countries in the European Economic Area entirely without constraint. So it's all one area. So GDPR covers all of the EEA, and that means that UK digital businesses can trade with all of the citizens of the EEA. So it's a 370 million person single market, and nobody is concerned about data being moved across the border between the UK and France or Germany, or pick your EEA country of choice. And that's because we were part of the EU. We are no longer part of the EU, but at the moment we're still part of the acquis, so we can still function on that basis. In December, at the end of December, unless things are delayed, we leave. And we become what's called a third country. And in a third country situation, there are rules that govern whether or not data about European citizens can be moved across that border. We have decided unilaterally that it'll be okay to send data on UK citizens out to the EEA, but the EEA has not decided that it'll be okay to send data on their citizens to the UK. So UK digital businesses risk losing access to the European market if we don't get what's called an adequacy agreement, which is an agreement that it's okay, as part of the overall Brexit trade agreement, which we have very little time left to negotiate. And we have already seen significant indication from the European Union that they're not very keen on the way Britain is currently using data. And that's particularly around the Investigatory Powers Act, the so-called Snoopers Charter, which is okay while you're inside the European Union because there's a special exemption for member state security services, but we won't be a member state anymore. And as a consequence, the European Union is not hugely inclined to give us an adequacy agreement, and they're on record as saying that. And now we've gone our own path with track and trace, which obviously, as we've talked about, has significant potential long-term consequences for the privacy of citizen data. We're making our lives harder still because we're still showing that we don't really want to work to the same rules, and adequacy is all about working to the same rules. And so, I mean, for me, this is really a question for John, which is what's the impact of UK digital losing access to the European market?
just before John answers that question, I want to just note, of course, our timetable, that we officially left the European Union on the 31st of January, and we are meant to end the transition period at the end of December. John, and then of course the UK government is very publicly very bullish on that we are going to meet that deadline. John, what is the chance that we're going to meet that deadline?
Zero, I would say, except in a totally fatuous sense. The point about trade negotiations is you can get a trade negotiation done in whatever time you're given. If you say, can you get a trade negotiation completed by the end of the year? Yes, you can, but it'll have almost no content. Negotiating a full trade agreement, which gets right down to detail. I mean, just take the area of mobile phones, doesn't just say, as the Canada EU free trade agreement does, the technical bodies in both countries will work together to see what they can achieve. That's all it says. Whereas the agreement that we've got by being part of the EU gets down to the level of saying you can even change your phone number between suppliers without cost and with complete right. Much more detailed. So it'll take a good 6 or 7 years to negotiate a trade agreement which has got any content of real worth to it. So something will be done by the end of the year, but it won't be worth much more than the paper it's written on.
Okay, and then to Ben's point, what about the economic consequences of a loss of data adequacy with the EU?
Well, the first point to be made, of course, about that is that that's virtually never been talked about. Just about all of the Brexit discussion has been couched in terms of goods, and this is services. And I know from people in government who've been saying for some time, look, do you realize how serious it is if we can't ship anything that has personal data attached to it, any service that has personal data attached to it, to the continent? What happens, just building on what Ben said, is if you don't get agreement at the national level, you have to get agreement at the company level, which is extremely expensive for companies to do. And won't be done by smaller companies. So you'll see a tendency for just another reason why a small company will say, look, I'm not getting into this exporting business. It's just too difficult. And now they've added another one. Paradoxically, Brexit has added another layer of bureaucracy and regulation to us.
Yeah.
Export.
And what is it? Sorry, John. When you say about this,
about services. So if suppose a fifth of them were to be affected by that, lops a couple of points off GDP. I don't think anybody has a basis for working the numbers out, but it's significant numbers of percentage points of GDP potentially, and just not being talked about. It's quite irresponsible.
Indeed. And John, so just remind us on the overall stats, what percentage of UK industry is services approximately?
You have to be very careful here. About 80% of the economy is services, but the vast bulk of them, of course, are not traded internationally. The whole retail sector is the biggest part of services. But nonetheless, about 8% of our GDP is services that are traded internationally. So that's pretty big. That's where I took the figure from, that suppose a quarter of that were affected, then that might have an effect on GDP of 2%. And that's the size of our defense budget, for example. It's quite extraordinary that something so big has not been talked about.
And Paul Jordan, one of our attendees, notes, drilling down into those numbers a little bit, that UK cloud solution companies provide 40% of EU cloud solutions to EU companies. So does this suggest that, as we've often heard, the EU needs us just as much as we need them, that they need us to have an adequacy agreement, Ben?
Well, not necessarily, no, because two things. One, there's been a bit of a tendency globally, and this was something that Angela Merkel started doing back in 2013, for something I call data protectionism, which is the idea that you try to keep your data inside your borders. And the EU is quite keen on this. It's why particularly the French regulator is putting so much pressure on big tech companies. And so there'll be a lot of pressure from the EU for either the transition of digital services to EU domiciled organizations, or for UK cloud companies to open European subsidiaries with European data centers and European operations and to do the processing of European data in Europe. And for those companies, that's obviously a substantial investment. It's also an outward flow of investment from the UK to the EU. So as a country that depends on inward flows of investment to balance our budget, that's not brilliant. And it will probably mean that there is, selection pressure for larger organizations that can afford to do that, removing the UK's status, amongst other things, as the, European headquarters of current tech startup investment. So one of the big threats here is we are in Britain, and particularly in London, the outside the US, the global capital of startup investment, particularly in fintech, and that will simply have to move, because right now, Revolut, for example, digital banking service, is based in London. It's not run by Brits. It's not a British company in any other sense, but it's incorporated in Britain because we have a great environment for tech startups and because they can passport their services out to the whole of the European Union. Frankly, if we'd gone through Brexit 5 years ago and failed to get adequacy, Revolut would be based in Berlin.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
And just the logistics of thinking of making those moves under the current global circumstances, even in lockdown, we're being told individuals can't move into new flats. So to try to organize that on an international scale for companies just staggers the mind. John, just again, looking at Brexit overall, I mean, the whole world is facing, questions about how to deal with the aftermath of the pandemic, what it looks like coming out of lockdown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the UK is unique because we've got to do that at the same time as dealing with Brexit. You've mentioned to me the insurance principle and how this applies to the extra hurdles that we face as a country over the coming years. Can you tell us what the insurance principle is and what that means in terms of the combination of Brexit and COVID aftermath?
Yes, with pleasure. And just before I do, let me make one more point, if I may.
Sure.
We've learned through this COVID process, and to a certain extent before, we've seen to an extent which surprised even me, and I've seen a fair bit, that people believe what they want to believe. We've seen it in Republicans versus Democrats. We see it in Brexit versus non-Brexit. And so you know perfectly well that if you come up with arguments which are pro-Brexit, they'll be believed by half of your listeners and disbelieved by the other half, and vice versa. So I just want to say, I'm not a Brit, I'm a New Zealander, and I don't really care what this country decides to do. I think I can stand back from this. And so to your insurance question, life's pretty difficult at the best of times. You do get smooth decades, the one that Lord Mervyn King once called the nice decade, but they're unusual. Most of the time there are problems, as that American editor Elbert Hubbard said, life is just one damn thing after another, and so it is. And usually you can handle these problems one at a time, but when you get two, or worse still when you get three, the system quite honestly can fall apart sometimes. And in insurance terms, American studies of serious accidents have shown if you have one of the preconditions present, the chance of a serious accident rises by 10%. If you have two of the preconditions present, they rise by 80%. And so I close on this Brexit point that life was difficult enough from 2008 onwards to get a recovery going. Then we made it more difficult, or the Brits made it more difficult for themselves by saying, you know what, we're going to leave the largest market in the world and make access to it more difficult for ourselves. And then just at the moment when you didn't need it, you got hit by this virus. So classic case of the insurance principle. You should go in with your car properly maintained and your house properly maintained and deal with the problems one-on-one. Certainly you shouldn't create extra difficulties for yourself.
Okay. Okay, Ben, so give us the key takeaway from this final topic, the Brexit risk and the risks of the adequacy agreement. What can companies do?
I think companies have to brace themselves for assuming we will not have adequacy. I'm afraid that's been our corporate take now for about 3 months, and that's what we're advising clients. And that means where you have the means to do it, you need to put in place the relevant mechanisms internally to transfer data, something called binding corporate rules. You need to have proper contracts with anybody outside your organization with whom you're sharing data across borders. Those are called standard contractual clauses. You may need to spin up operations in the European Union, at least to have a representative there, and also possibly to have an establishment there. So, look at opening a branch office so that you have somewhere to function from, and really understand what your dependency on cross-border data flows looks like and what the implications for you of those flows being impeded might be. I don't think now it is prudent to operate on the assumption that we will have an adequacy agreement from whenever the actual Brexit exit date ends up being. I agree with John that it's bound to be delayed.
Okay. Okay. And when should companies start doing all this preparation, analyzing their exposure and mitigating risk? About 3 months ago, right? So, so I guess if they do have a little bit of extra time in lockdown, that this would be a very good use of that time.
Very good thing to think about, yeah.
And can Securys help them out with that?
This is not a marketing webinar, but yes, oddly enough, that is something that we do.
I just thought I'd check. But okay, so we have overrun slightly in terms of our agenda, but I'm going to encourage people to keep sending in questions, and we will move finally to the final question and answer session. So we've had a good one in from Sasha Brooks as well, which I'm going to read out in a moment, but let me first return to that bigger one that Steve posed for John. Does Wall Street know something that we don't in terms of why stock markets are holding up so well? So first of all, is that premise correct? Are stock markets holding up, John?
Well, they fell a lot, of course, but we haven't seen a Wall Street crash, and I think that's the point behind the question. And I think the simple answer is in times like this, what else would you hold? What other assets would you want to hold? Would it be a time to hold commercial real estate? We've discussed reasons why maybe not. Would you want to buy a house? We've discussed reasons why maybe not. It's not the Western tradition to buy gold. So your choices really are real assets in the form of stocks or government bonds. And would you buy government bonds at a time when governments are going to debt like they never have? No. So I think it's if you know a better hole, go to it. And in this case, they don't. It's stocks or nothing. Real assets.
Real assets. And John, can you maybe throw a few more numbers at us? I mean, if we've all been following the news, we've heard lots of numbers about how much the economy has contracted so far. I wonder if you are able to put a number on that and any forecasting for what you think the GDP, how it'll be affected, and the economy overall in future.
Well, going back to what I said at the beginning about uncertainty, I put numbers on and they're probably not worth much. But just to give you some examples, the Great Depression in America in the 1920s, GDP fell by 30% over 3 years. That's probably the biggest we've ever seen. The UK in the Great Depression, about 10 or 12%. Those are probably two of the markers that you would pick. If you look at what we're seeing in the country so far, we've seen both the US and France have experienced a 5% actual fall in GDP in the second quarter, but that was really all just came in 1 month. So there are clearly some walloping numbers for declines to come in the second quarter. As to what people are saying, well, the National Institute yesterday came out and think GDP in the UK is going to fall by 7% this year. The IMF is running with figures around 13 to 15%, depending on the country, and so is the Office of Budget Responsibility. So there's the range. Personally, I would be more inclined to go towards the 13, 14, 15 range than the 7, but who knows? But we're talking about large falls in GDP relative to anything that we've seen except in the US during the Great Depression.
Wow. That's incredible. Okay, I'm going to turn to a wonderful question from Sasha Brooks. It's kind of lengthy, so I'm not sure I can read it all out. But Sasha, this kind of speaks to the behavioral changes and how that affects us as individuals and I guess our business prospects. So Sasha is saying that home working is requiring us to connect with everyone all the time and lots of new people. And he so far resisted downloading Zoom at all and not really keen on these video calls. He's come on today, installed GoToWebinar because without doing his customer research, because he trusts me and Ben. Thank you, Sasha. Hello to you. We trust you too. And but he's saying this is now making him very unpopular, and he is also concerned about on the internet you're not able to see. It turned out you can hear eyes rolling even on the internet, sorry. So he's wondering, what is the implication for people who hold out like him? Are there going to be, more social and professional backlash for not engaging in Zooms and the like? And Ola, actually, this final question, what reasons, if any, will become acceptable for declining to use a given platform? Or do you think that in the future, we're just going to have all of these platforms and really great tech at home all the time? Ben?
It's a good question. I mean, we corporately have banned Zoom, and that's already proving troublesome because clearly we have clients and other counterparties who haven't, and that's their chosen platform. And you have to take a view on the commercial impact of allowing Zoom, putting special controls around when people can use Zoom, and that, anything that introduces friction into commerce, as I'm sure John will agree, is bad. Ultimately, I think, as with all of tech, there is an adoption period and people will get better at using it. There will be a degree of evolutionary pressure and some platforms will survive and others won't. We've seen other people banning Zoom, so clearly Zoom know they're under pressure. They're either going to fix it or they won't. We know that mass adoption and mass desertion are both features of tech platforms. You remember Tom from MySpace, right? So MySpace was a big thing and then it vanished and now nobody is on MySpace. So people can move on to other platforms if they think they're better. I think being an actual tech refusenik and trying to stay off video calling is not a thing. I think it's going to be extremely difficult to do business for at least the next 9 months unless you accept that this is the way things are done now. I mean, I'm not a huge fan either, but it is what it is. And what people will have to do is become savvier about it. There will be, I think, a secondary market in tool sets to secure what you're doing. I mean, the obvious thing with Zoom is to run it in a virtual machine, but not everybody knows how to do that or has the horsepower in their desktop machine to accommodate particularly video in that environment. But so there will be people producing ways of partitioning off your business life from your personal life if you're using the same machine for both. There's lots of people already offering training in this new normal. And I think it's another strand of economic activity. I think trying to deny it is going to be a little bit like carrying on doing everything by post in the era of email. And we know that doesn't really work.
Okay, I have to get in one question of mine. It's something that's really playing on me. Coming back to immunity passports, when I first heard this term, it seemed to me like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's the way that we can quickly get back to some semblance of normality. But the more I read about them and the more I speak to you, Ben, the more it really frightens the bejesus out of me. And I'm thinking again in terms of mass gatherings. If I think about my own industry, and Sasha, if I think about theater, what happens if somebody does show up on a Friday night at a sold-out show, if we can have those again, sold-out shows, and they don't have an immunity passport? Do they get turned away? And what implications does that have for the business? Do they get a refund? I don't know, what happens in that scenario? Can you give me an idea?
Ask yourself what happens if you turn up to get on an airplane and haven't brought your passport. You don't get on the plane and you get a refund, right? It's part of the new normal. Remember that we've only had passports since 1870, and they're not features of history. So we accept these constraints as being necessary for usually reasons of national security, very much like immunity passports. And so I think, yeah, that'll be the likelihood. Obviously, at some point, you begin to get the recognition that if you have an audience, 98% of whom have immunity passports, actually the other 2% aren't going to do any damage because, well, 98% are immune by definition. But there's always that question, well, how many non-immune people do you let in? And the answer, if you're being risk averse, as everybody is these days, is none. So I think that's the worry for me, that these things only work if they are enforced and ubiquitous.
And also, actually, if you do let somebody in, if the theater lets somebody in who turns out to not be immune, and other audience members are transmitted the disease or infected, what happens? Is the theater liable?
Well, that's the worry, isn't it? That's back to this litigation culture we live in, where yes, I think this is precisely why. I mean, coming back to the point about employers and doing, screening of employees, and one of the over-collection issues at the moment is everybody trying to collect COVID status in advance of allowing people to come into a shared working environment. They're worried clearly both about real well-being, but also about the possible litigation risk if they allow an infectious carrier to come into their environment. And I think that's just the nature of the world we live in now, and people will follow the path of least resistance, I suspect.
Well, that's gives me lots more to think about, and there's so much more we could cover here. I'm sorry, we are now needing to wrap things up, and just to remind you, if I can get to the next screen, I might ask Cindy to click if I can't. Whoops, okay. Yes, so thanks so much for some great insights that you've shared with us, Ben and John. You can get in touch with Ben and Securys at the links there, and to John and Llewellyn Consulting. You can see the links on the slide, and a white paper that is available there on LinkedIn via Securys. If we go to the next slide, I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of these discussions are based on a great series of vlogs and blogs that Securys have been publishing. I really encourage you to look at all of those, and you can see there are plenty of links there for you to be getting on with. You will receive these slides and a recording of today's webinar. So please do get in touch with those guys if you have more that you want to pick up on. So finally, I would just say thank you again to Ben and to John and to Peter from Trusted Network. Peter, are you still there? Okay, there you are. So I'm just now going to just say thank you again, Ben, John, and Peter, and any final words from each of you. Ben?
No, I think it's just reminding everybody that privacy still matters, and that privacy matters because people matter.
Okay, that's a great point. And John?
We're in for a tough time economically, but you never want to waste a good crisis, and the people who take the right decisions here will do well, and the people who don't won't. It's the time to be intelligent, not emotional.
Thank you. And Peter?
Yeah, I just I said at the beginning it was going to be a fascinating conversation, discussion, and I think it really was. And we just touched the surface. So I'd really like to thank Ben and John for their time, and also for being so insightful around the whole area of data and the economy. And I'd like to think we're going to sort of follow up and maybe look at other areas around this for future trusted events. So yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, everybody.
And I would just want to say, I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. There's a great questions from Shadi Razak as well. So I would encourage you, Shadi, to follow up with Ben on your questions. It sounds like you've got some concerns and some great points to raise. And thank you to Paul and Sasha and everyone else who's gotten involved. And that was great fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.